Fishhead, written by Gene Fritz, illustrated by Mark Simont, narrated by Chris Santo. This book is dedicated to David and Andrea. Fishhead was a cat, a raggedy, scraggledy, patched up, scratched up cat, and right to the tip of his chewed up tail, Fishhead was proud. Everyone on Clambake Island knew him. They were all used to seeing him pound down the waterfront with a stolen fish head dripping from his mouth. And so most of the people, most of the time, called him Fishhead. But not the butcher at the waterfront market. He called him a long-tailed, liver-loving thief, and he threw potatoes from the vegetable counter at him. And not the people behind the waterfront windows. When Fishhead sat on the dock on moonlit nights and howled at the sky, they called him a public nuisance and a dirty wharf cat. They threw empty milk bottles and old shoes and tin cans at him. But Fishhead was quicker than the butcher. He was quicker than the people behind the windows. He went right on doing just what he liked to do, just when he liked to, and just how he liked to do it. He was that kind of cat. One drizzly Saturday night, Fishhead was doing what he liked most of all to do. He was chasing a rat, a fat grandfather rat who knew the waterfront as well as Fishhead did. In the back alleys they started. They raced through the shadows, flung themselves around corners, and skidded through doorways, up fire escapes and over rooftops. Tail streaming and ears flattened, Fishhead was only 2 tail lengths behind when they reached the waterfront market. Then whish, poof, the rat disappeared, right before Fishhead's eyes, down through a private rat hole and into the waterfront market. Fishhead slid to a short stop. He peeked down the rat hole and lashed his tail. His whiskers quivered. He peered down the hole again. Was the hole too small? Would he fit? He measured it. It was as wide as his face, whisker to whisker. Fishhead squeezed and flattened and stretched himself like a long roll of pulled-out dough. He wriggled and pushed and squirmed. Suddenly he found himself on the floor of the waterfront market behind a barrel of apple cider. And there, hanging over the side of the barrel, was a long, drooping tail. On the other end of it was fat Grandfather Rat, panting and trembling. Fishhead licked his lips and slicked out his whiskers. He crouched low, slowly, carefully, paw by paw. Fishhead crept closer and closer to the barrel. Grandfather Rat was puffing and twitching all over. Eek! He squealed as he smelled danger. He made a flying leap into a basket of grapefruit, with Fishhead hot behind him. Then up on the soup shelf, 2 cans of split pea soup crashed to the floor. Up and down, around and around the waterfront market, Grandfather Rat twisted and turned, with Fishhead never even a shelf's distance away. Soap boxes toppled from their perch. Pickle jars rolled on the floor. Milk bottles fell and trickled onto flour sacks. A big bottle of treacle shivered and broke into 1,000 pieces as Fishhead thundered past. Apples and oranges bounced into the sticky pool of treacle. The waterfront market was upset from top to bottom as Grandfather Rat reached his hole behind the barrel of apple cider. Up he streaked into the night. Up went Fishhead right after, out onto the docks, over and under the wooden plankings, flop, onto the deck of a boat. Then Fishhead pounced, front paws on a gray, stringy rat tail. Blunderation! It wasn't a rat tail at all, only the stringy end of a rope lying loose on the deck. And Grandfather Rat was gone. He had slithered off into hiding places that he knew best, while Fishhead, who had never been on a boat before, stood panting for breath. Everywhere he nosed there were new strange smells. He looked in buckets. He looked behind a coil of rope. No Grandfather Rat. At last Fishhead gave up and flung himself on the deck to rest. He was still there when the funny chug-chugging started, but he was too tired to notice. Slap, slap, slap. Sh, 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 sh. Put, put, put. The boat was moving. But not until the waterfront lights were just specks in the distance did Fishhead look up. He raced to the deck's railing. Where was the dock? Where was the market? He paced the deck backward and forward. He climbed to the top of the mast. At last Fishhead knew that he was at sea, and he didn't like it. With an unhappy growl, he curled up on an old piece of canvas sail and fell asleep. All night long the deck became wetter and rockier. The wind blew tougher. The sea grew much, much rougher. And Fishhead, a round, bedraggled knot on a soaking deck, was more and more miserable. Finally he dragged himself dripping from the canvas and crept down the slippery deck towards a ladder and a patch of light below it. He pushed through a door at the foot of the ladder and found himself blinking at a brightly lighted room, a tall red-headed sailor and a short bald-headed sailor. The bald-headed sailor looked at Fishhead and nudged the red-headed sailor. "Look there, Carrots," he said. "We've got a dratted stowaway aboard." Carrots whistled a long, low whistle of surprise. "It's that sneaking wharf cat, Fishhead," he grinned. Fishhead humped up his back and spat at the two sailors. He was that kind of cat. He did just what he liked to do. At least he usually did. A sudden heave of the boat sent Fishhead sliding across the floor as if he had been on roller skates. No sooner had he picked himself up than the boat tilted again. Head over heels he tumbled, bumping into chairs and banging against walls. He landed at the feet of Carrots, the red-headed sailor, along with a broken cup, 2 pillows, and a can of tobacco. Fishhead couldn't make his legs behave at all. Every time he went to take a step, the floor wasn't there. It was like walking on a seesaw. And all the time, the two sailors were leaning back in their chairs, filling the cabin with great bellows of laughter. "He's up!" Carrots shouted. "He's down! Flat on his nose!" He hooted and shook with his laughing. Now Fishhead didn't mind being called names. He was used to milk bottles and tin cans and potatoes. But laughing? No one had ever laughed at him before, and he didn't like it. Fishhead loosened his claws. He fumbled over to the sailor's chair. Back he slipped. A few more steps. Back again. At last he hooked one paw around a chair leg. Then out went the right paw, claws bared, on the sailor's ankle, a deep, clean swipe, and it was well timed. "Hot jumping frog's legs!" yelled the red-headed sailor as he leaped to his feet. "You ugly spitfire, you!" he shouted at Fishhead, and he stood hopping on one foot, holding the other ankle in his hands. Wham! Plop! Down crashed the red-headed sailor to the floor. Down crashed his chair on top of him. Down crashed a coffee pot and a plate of donuts. For a moment it was very quiet. Fishhead braced himself. He got ready for the coffee pot to come sailing through the air. He crouched. But Carrots didn't reach for the coffee pot. He didn't reach for anything. He just opened his mouth wide and let out a great blustering laugh. "Fishhead," he said, "you're a low-living, nasty-tempered beast, but I deserve that." He sat up and rubbed his ankle. Then Carrots got to his feet and went to the icebox in the corner. He took out a chicken wing and tossed it to Fishhead. Fishhead snatched the food because he was used to snatching food. But something was the matter. He couldn't eat it. His stomach felt lumpy and his head felt twirly. For 2 days he lay quietly in a corner and didn't dare try out his legs. For 2 days the storm hammered at the boat. On the 3rd day the wind stopped. When Fishhead woke up, the sun was shining. The boat was bobbing pleasantly on the water like an apple at Halloween. Fishhead tried his legs, and they worked. He could walk. He could even run. Quickly he padded across the room, out the door, up the ladder, and onto the deck. Water stretched away from all sides of the boat, but Fishhead didn't see it. 3 marshmallow clouds sprawled across the sky. Fishhead didn't see them either. There was a clean, washed up, fresh smell in the air. Fishhead certainly didn't smell that, because he was seeing something else and smelling something else, and he could hardly believe his luck. There on the deck before him were 3 blue and silver fish, lying there as nice as you please and ready for his breakfast. Fishhead wasted no time. He had just sunk his teeth into the back of the first fish when something hard and wet came skimming through the air. It hit Fishhead plunk on the back. Whatever it was felt like a slithery cake of soap. It looked like a toy airplane, but it smelled like a fish. And it was a fish, a flying fish with fins like wings. It flipped and flopped on the deck. Fishhead put a firm paw on it and saw that it was blue and silver like the others. It tasted like the others too. Good! When he had finished eating, there were 4 back bones picked bare. Fishhead was lolling on the prow of the boat, taking a sunbath. Every morning after that, at the first slit of daylight, Fishhead raced to the deck. One very exciting morning, Fishhead found the deck slopping over with fish. He ate until his sides bulged, and there were still 5 fish left over. After a while, Fishhead could even catch fish in the air. He would spot one on the fly, leap up, and land with it neatly in his mouth. Fishhead learned many things. He discovered a tiny room with a steering wheel and another sailor. He was a burly, black-bearded sailor, and they called him Kegs. Kegs and Carrots and the bald-headed sailor took turns at the steering wheel. Some days they turned off the motor and hoisted up a big white sail. Some days they dropped anchor instead. Then all 3 sailors stayed on deck. They took off their shirts and sang sailor songs so loud it set the buckets on the deck dancing. And Fishhead, in his favorite new perch in the crow's nest at the top of the mast, howled along with them. No one liked a hearty song better than Fishhead. Sometimes they stopped at strange islands. Each time Carrots and the bald-headed sailor shaved carefully. All 3 sailors filled their pockets with jingly coins before they went ashore. When they came back, their pockets were empty, but sometimes they carried fresh pineapple on their shoulders. Sometimes they brought back baskets brimming over with chocolate bonbons, peanut brittle, caramel drops, twisted licorice sticks, candied cherries, and figs. One time they were all 3 blowing new harmonicas and wearing shiny gold rings. And always, tucked away, there was a little package stuffed full of fresh catnip. Fishhead never went ashore with the sailors. He wanted nothing to do with strange islands. He wanted only to set foot again upon the wooden plankings of his own dock on his own island. Each time he sighted land from his lookout point in the crow's nest, Fishhead hoped it would be Clambake Island. Once it was Logman's Cove. Once it was Biscuit Bay. Other times it was other islands, shaped differently, smelling different. One morning Fishhead saw again a round hump of land in the distance. Kegs was at the steering wheel, while Carrots and the bald-headed sailor were shaving. The closer they came, the more familiar the land looked. It was certainly the shape of Clambake Island. It smelt right, too. It was Clambake Island. Fishhead could see the waterfront, the dock, and then the market. Now he could even see the butcher walking up to the market with an apron full of fresh clams. Fishhead was the first one off the boat. He thought what fun it was going to be to rush between the butcher's legs and make him spill those clams. He pushed his hind legs up high. He leveled his head on the ground, ready for a fast takeoff. But when Fishhead started to run, everything went wrong. His legs were wobbly. He stumbled. The wooden plankings of the dock seemed to be swaying up and down. Fishhead was used to the roll of a boat. It took him all day to steady his legs enough to walk on dry land. By that time, the waterfront market was closed and the butcher had gone to bed. And Fishhead was hungry. He saw a few rats scurrying around the dock, but they looked scrawny and uninteresting. Not worth a chase. The moon came out and Fishhead stretched his neck for a song. He yowled and wailed, but it sounded queer. His voice didn't have the good clear ring it had 20 miles out at sea. Fishhead was restless. He was cross. He didn't know what was wrong. The waterfront seemed all at once a very dull place. Then suddenly, from the other end of the dock, a deep voice called out into the night. It was Carrots, the red-headed sailor. He was standing on deck with his hands cupped to his mouth. "Fishhead!" he shouted. "Hey, Fishhead! All aboard!" he called. Fishhead stood up. He raised his tail straight up in the air as only a proud cat will do. Like a flag he carried it, and he swaggered over to the boat, just as any sailor does who's going to sea. Fishhead jumped on deck as the motor started to chug. Fishhead was doing just what he liked to do, just when he liked to, and just how he liked to do it. He was that kind of cat.